On this episode of the Mad Rush podcast.
Moms and dads are so important in this process because they know their kids the best. So I think number one thing is if something feels off and they're being secretive about food or, not eating in restaurants they used to eat, or, they come home for dinner and they don't want something more indulgent. If you're noticing things that are just not typical of your daughter around food. And that's why it's great that you have, usually in schools, a fall break and then Thanksgiving right after, because that's a lot of times when parents realize there's a problem.
Welcome to the Mad Rush podcast. I'm Trisha Addix, the original Sorority Rush consultant. While the stories I have to share are nothing short of astonishing, this podcast goes beyond the wild client tales and sorority life. I'll be engaging with fascinating guests from both within and outside the Greek world, uncovering the surprising connections that bind us all together. Join me for a journey that's as entertaining as it is enlightening. Welcome to Mad Rush. So today we are joined by Dr. Jennifer Van Beck. She is a clinical psychologist based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she has the accent to go with it. And she has vast experience helping young women work through the issues they face, including anxiety, depression, eating and body image issues. And I can't wait to talk to her about this. And I'm so excited you're here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Trisha, for inviting me to be here.
Of course. Okay, so first let's talk about you.
So I'm Dr. Jennifer Van Beck. I am originally from Long Island, New York.
That's where the accent comes from.
Yes, it comes out more and more as I'm talking. So I'm a Midwest transplant. So I grew up on Long Island. I went to college at the University of Rochester, which is a small school in upstate New York. And while I was up there, my sorority, Sigma Delta Tau, was a big part of my life.
SDT.
So it was a really positive experience for me. One thing I like to tell people about my sorority experience was my parents always tell me that one of the happiest times they've ever seen me was when I got a bid to the sorority I wanted, and I called them, and I was just, even to this day, even though it was more than 20 years ago, I still remember that feeling of being accepted, I had found my people, I was okay. And that was a really powerful feeling. And I think it's one of the reasons I became interested in working with college students as a psychologist and especially working with women in sororities, because I remember that experience and all the wonderful things that came along with it and all the challenges. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, that's amazing. And I love to hear that, because there really is nothing better as a parent than when your child has found their people. And I know exactly how your parents felt. And that is what I strive for every day, for these girls to find their people. So I was in the documentary Bama Rush, and Bama Rush was a lot of things. It wasn't really all that much about Bama Rush, but one of the things that stuck out to me, and they didn't have the time to delve into all these things, but the crazy amount of issues that these young women are facing when they're in college. And so I really want to get into. Anyway, the reason I bring up the documentary is because I feel like they just touched on it, but then it was a little bit overwhelming because they were, you're seeing this documentary, you're thinking you're seeing a documentary about Rush, and it ends up being about a whole lot of other stuff. But it's very clear to me, doing what I do, that there are so many issues that these young kids or young women are facing today that were not as prevalent when I was in college. And so I would love for you to talk to us, touch on some of them, but I would really like to get into the eating disorder and body image because I don't know if you know this, but I've struggled with my weight my whole life. And I've been on literally every diet. I'm not saying I had an eating disorder, but I do get that is a huge issue facing them. So I would like to get more into that, but, I'll touch on the other stuff too.
So one of the best things about this generation of college students is that they are very open about their mental health issues. They talk about depression and anxiety pretty freely, and a lot of them will, talk about seeing therapists. They'll watch TikToks with a mental health bend. So I think the awareness that mental health issues affect people at this stage in life is wonderful. However, I think there's a lot of talk and not a lot of understanding about, what these things exactly are. So yeah, I definitely want to talk more about the eating disorder stuff, body image stuff, because that's kind of my specialty. But with anxiety and depression, when I'm working with the college students, the first thing I tell them is that, this is a normal thing. First of all, everyone experiences a certain level of anxiety and depression. It's along a continuum, right? So accepting that and realizing that's just a part of being human is really important.
So what are you saying? And I'm sorry, if you've listened to my podcast, you know that when I get a thought, I'm old and it goes out of my head really quickly. So what I end up interrupting my guests, and that's just the way. That's the
totally
jam.
Okay.
Are you saying that there is a quote unquote normal level of anxiety and depression that is not alarming, or I don't even know if any of it's alarming, but is there like everyone has some of it, right?
Absolutely. There's not one person in the world who's not anxious occasionally or depressed occasionally.
Gotcha.
When anxiety and depression become an issue is when you're spending a significant time during the day being affected by them. So let's start with anxiety. You're spending a lot of the day worrying. You're avoiding things that you worry about. You're having a lot of self-conscious thoughts about yourself. And maybe what's going on with this anxiety is it's preventing you from doing your best at school. Maybe it's preventing you from spending time with your friends when it would be a really healthy thing. Maybe it's making you, not take that hard class because somehow you don't feel good enough. Another thing that's very common with anxiety and with eating disorders is perfectionism. So a lot of people, when the anxiety gets bad enough, it's because it's not perfect, right? And it's one of the toughest things to work on, but if you could get a handle on perfectionism, it's so good for mental health. So, with anxiety, and there's so many great tools for anxiety that people can use in college to just master it a little bit more. And we don't have a ton of time to get into them, but I always say there's mindfulness skills and distraction skills with any type of, mental health issue, basically where you're listening to your feelings, you're paying attention to things, you're noticing your triggers. Maybe on Sundays you feel more depressed, and there's a lot of reasons why, you're going through a work week, there's more pressure. And, being aware of your triggers and being honest with yourself and journaling and getting it all done could be really helpful. And then there's your distraction skills, which really help you take it when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling depressed, to not sit in those feelings. If you let yourself sit in those feelings, usually it just gets worse. So it's what can I do to distract myself? Now, that could be as easy as watching TV, watching TikToks, although I like to say TV is actually a way healthier coping skill because your mind's focused on one thing and you're not constantly, going on to the next reel. But, ideally, it's something like talking with a friend, taking a walk, doing some kind of breathing exercises, doing something that you enjoy. Maybe it's knitting, maybe it's painting, maybe it's whatever it is for you. Maybe it's just doing some pampering stuff, going to get your nails and your hair done. There's so many ideas. And people who really master those skills in college, it benefits their career, it benefits their social life, and it benefits their confidence. If they see, I could have control over my emotions. And when these feelings come up, I know they're not going to last forever. And I'm capable of dealing with them.
That's very, I was thinking when you were saying that, the times that I have really spiraled with my anxiety and worry are when I've just, like you said, I can remember even recently sitting in my room just staring at a wall just because I felt kind of paralyzed. And if I had distracted myself, then I feel like that would have been very much more healthy than staring at a wall and just letting I'm very OCD also. So I have the same thought over and over and over and over again. But yeah, that's the distracting tip is really good. And I'm going to write that down. So, okay. So those tools for that are great. And like you said, we don't have enough time to get into all of them, but let's talk about what you're seeing. If you are seeing eating disorder, I can also remember growing up, there were a few specific people that I knew had eating disorders, but it didn't seem to be something so prevalent. And I feel like I cannot speak to why or whatever, but I feel like maybe there's a trend or, that you're seeing or something. So talk to us about that.
So I think the most useful way to explain this is to talk about what's disordered eating and what's a true eating disorder. Because yes, the word eating disorder could be used kind of casually. And you know what? Sometimes people's behaviors and feelings about food do meet criteria for an eating disorder. But there's a difference, and it's important to kind of be aware of. So, and secondly, there's some of it's awareness, right? Like eating disorders, even amongst like my field, weren't really the first residential treatment center in the country didn't open up until like the late 1980s. Like there was just not this
Duke?
awareness.
Is that Duke?
No, Renfrew, where actually I did my postdoc. So there wasn't a great awareness of this, but you would see like Karen Carpenter was probably amazing, as sad as it was that she passed away, for people becoming aware of eating disorders, because that's someone everyone knew. There's become more an awareness of eating disorders. People have been more open. And there's now so many different categories. Like, for example, there's anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, which, everyone kind of knows what those are. And then actually the most prevalent eating disorder is something called other specified feeding or eating disorders, which is like a mix of a lot of behaviors. That disorder tends to be like, you question whether it's disordered eating or an eating disorder. And then there's things like orthorexia, only eating organic foods.
Oh, wow.
Drunkorexia, like restricting so you could drink more, which is actually something I'll talk about with sororities because it's definitely an issue. So there's so many categories, but disordered eating is when maybe you're restricting, dieting, going to the gym a little bit too much. So like some of the behaviors are concerning, but you're not losing like a ton of weight. You're not doing it every day. You're not like consumed by poor body image thoughts all the time. You're able to kind of see that your behavior is not healthy, like you have some awareness. With eating disorders, a lot of times what happens, it begins to affect the brain more, and people are in denial that they have a problem, even though like if you look at their behavior, it's obvious. Like they've lost a ton of weight or gained a ton of weight. They've become weird or secretive about food. Like they'll stop eating in front of people. Like their sleep habits will change. They have trouble paying attention. Like they maybe become more impulsive. Like there's a real change in their behavior related to whatever the eating disorder is. And when it really becomes an eating disorder is when you really can't stop it on your own and you need professional help. Very rarely someone with a true eating disorder can decide they're going to recover one day and just recover on their own. Usually it involves like a therapist, sometimes a dietitian, sometimes medical intervention. So they're complicated illnesses. So I think that's one reason eating disorders, it seems like they're so common. But
because there's a lot of disordered eating versus
there's a lot of disordered
Gotcha.
eating versus eating disorders. And even how they define it. Like there's some statistic out there saying like 20 to 30% of college women have an eating disorder.
Wow.
I would say that 20 to 30%, maybe, again, I'm not a statistician, but probably the number of treating disorders is more like 5 to 10%, I'm guessing.
Right.
And like the other part of it is people who have disordered eating. And I'm not minimizing disordered eating in any way. A lot of times, the best thing you could do if you have disordered eating is getting help from a therapist, like pretty early on, to prevent it from going into a full-blown eating disorder. Because with eating disorders, the earlier you catch it, the higher the rate, the better the prognosis.
So a lot of people that listen to this are moms and parents that listen to this podcast. And I don't know how to get you to explain that, but I want to talk about both levels. Like, so if you have a daughter or son, but is it primarily disordered eating and eating disorders, young women?
Yes, but there's also many men who struggle with disordered eating and eating disorders more than you would think.
There was this one guy in Charlotte. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I remember him. He was anorexic, but I remember my mom is a psychologist, and my dad's was a pediatrician. But I remember my mom saying that's very rare, for a male, and I hope he recovered. And anyway, but for parents, like, I would like to get into both of those things. One, if you're worried or if you're seeing, how do you recognize it in someone else?
Sure, that's a great question. And moms and dads are so important in this process because they know their kids the best. So I think number one thing is use your intuition. If something feels off about how, I'm going to go with daughters here, how your daughter's eating habits have changed, weight loss or weight gain. There's like the freshman 15, and then some people start school and like lose a little bit of weight, right? But it's like, if something feels off and they're being secretive about food or, not eating in restaurants they used to eat, or, they come home for dinner and they don't want something more indulgent. If you're noticing things that are just not typical of your daughter around food.
But but what if your daughter is at school and you don't see her?
Yeah, and that's really tough. And that's why it's great that you have, usually in schools, a fall break and then Thanksgiving right after, because that's a lot of times when parents realize there's a problem. I mean, that's tough, right? Because you're not seeing your child every day, but hopefully you're in good communication with them. Not too much, which will go over to
I was going to say, if I have boys, but it is unbelievable. Some of my friends, and I'm jealous, so don't get me wrong, but like they're in like constant contact with their daughters in college. And I'm like, wow, like, that's just not how boys, or at least my boys were.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not saying anything negative about either one of these situations. It was just very different. And I'm like, whoa, these people are in constant contact with their daughters. So I guess you would be able to tell a little bit more.
Well, the great thing about that is that they're going to be able to tell us something's off because of the constant contact. They're also probably seeing pictures on their daughter's social media. So if there has been a weight change, they could tell, right? And I also always tell parents, like, ask your daughter about, like, how are the dining halls? Like, who are you eating with? Like, what's your favorite, like, meal? Or, like, is it, like, very different than eating at home? How are you doing with, like, all the choices? Whatever your school has, like, kind of find out, are they struggling with anything? So, but I think most of the time what happens is someone comes home, and a lot of times there are like indications in high school that something might be off, But I think what happens is, your daughter will come home during fall break or Thanksgiving, especially during Thanksgiving, and you'll notice there's changes in how she's eating. Oftentimes there's like mood changes. She doesn't seem as excited about school or friends. Like something just feels off. And I always encourage parents to bring that stuff up in a loving way, right? Not an accusatory way, but it's important for your daughter to know that you're noticing that something's going on, that you're seeing like, this is a way she's expressing pain, and like, we need to watch this. Like, we may need to do something about this. And that's why I recommend therapy for everyone in college, their freshman year, ideally, throughout college. But just because so many pressures come up that are unlike any other time in life. Like, when are you just, you start in a school with all new people. Maybe you know a few people, right? And then there's like rush if you're involved in rush, which is like the most complicated, anxiety-provoking social situation there might be in life, right? So just like paying attention to how all these things are affecting your daughter, and, and encouraging her, like if you're seeing things, be like, you know what, like I hear about girls your age seeing therapists all the time. Like, would you want to try doing that? And, see what they say. Yeah.
Well, I had a psychologist on here, and she suggested that you find out your resources, you being one of them, before you go. So it's less reactionary and more, okay, I've got this in place, and so I can reach out to Dr. Van Beck if, when the time comes, kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I have a lot, it's oftentimes very hard to navigate finding a therapist. So I'll give parents a few tips. Usually in college towns, like Ann Arbor has more therapists per capita than any other city in the country. Therapists tend to congregate in college towns. So usually it might take some work to find a therapist who's a great fit, but usually there's private therapists available. I wish I could say like university counseling centers were ideal, and certain schools provide great services. But what usually happens is you go to a university counseling center, it takes you a few months to get in, you get like 5 or 6 sessions, and you're usually being seen by a graduate student, like higher up in their training, but not like a licensed mental health professional. So, I think it's really important if you think your daughter is going to benefit from therapy to look. And I could give different resources depending on the issue.
And I feel like that's the way that it is with so many things. The schools, some do a great job. I'm not trying to call, and some Parental, which is the governing body of sororities, they do a great job. But the number of people that they are having to, I just feel like some things get lost because Absolutely. Of the lack of resources and people that, like you said, it could take months to get in to a school therapist. And do some private therapists work on a sliding scale, or do you, I'm not asking if you do, I'm just saying because I feel like the financial barrier might also be a little difficult too.
Well, many, many therapists take insurance throughout the country. Okay. So you could contact your health insurance company and get a list of all the therapists. Like say you're in Alabama, you get a list of all the therapists in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. There's also a site. It's www.psychologytoday.com that a lot of therapists list themselves on, and you could put in your insurance, right? Or if you don't want them to use insurance, you could put in that, and then the people you're seeing are people who take your insurance, right? And then you could specify male therapists, female therapists, and then I suggest just calling around. For more serious issues, what's great in college towns is, if you go to University Health Center or CAPS, they usually know the experts in the city your daughter's going to college in, and could make more of a direct referral. But there's definitely resources. And again, certain campuses do it better than others. Also now with the advent of virtual therapy, like I could see clients in 42 states.
Right.
And even like, say you're in Alabama, you could see a therapist in Montgomery, Alabama, right? Like if you do virtual. So there's definitely more therapists available now than probably ever before.
That's good. That's good to know and hear. And I think that like you said, one of the bonuses of all of this is that people, like you said, are way more willing to talk about it. Okay, so let's say your daughter comes home and you're not, you're starting to see some changes that, and again, I think, and I know you mentioned this, but as far as weight gain, I feel like we've all seen, the freshman 50. How do you determine whether, and having lived through this, I know that it's very touchy to.
It is very touchy.
I mean, if my mom said something to me about my weight, I would have lost my shit on her.
Well, so what I'm about to tell you might, everyone take a minute with this because it might not make sense in the context of what I'm saying, but the best advice I could give to parents, both moms and dads, is to not comment on your own weight or body image. Don't comment on what foods are good or bad. And try to just, if you're seeing social media, if you're looking on TV or social media, be like, that person's airbrushed, right? Like no one looks like that. Because they've done a ton of research studies on this, but one of the best things for a daughter's body image is her mother's own body image, and talk about food at home, right? So even if you're on a diet, right? Don't tell your daughter you're on a diet. Try to have a variety of foods in the house. This is like, if you take one thing from me from this meeting, the best thing you can do to prevent eating disorders is to have a variety of foods in your house, not just healthy foods. Like you have more indulgent foods in moderation, right? Because you want, that's a goal with any kind of eating disorder, disordered eating recovery. There's no bad foods, right?
That's such great advice. And I think most of my friends know this about me, but my parents did not allow junk food in the house. And I had one great parent, they didn't know, they did not allow junk food. And so I would go over to my friend Anna Lindsay's house, and Anna Lindsay did not have and doesn't have a weight issue, but she had all the foods in her house. So I would go and I would sit in her pantry. I'm not making this up, and gorge myself on Doritos and M&Ms and all the things, and the Coke and, soft drinks, because I didn't have access to them. Anna Lindsay could have cared less about the food in her pantry. But to me, it was like this smorgasbord. And so I would just make myself sick eating all the food because I didn't have access to it. I've said this my whole, like moderation, the same thing. I wasn't allowed to watch TV. So what did I do when I got to college? I ate everything. I watched TV all the time. And it was not a very healthy, way to exist. And so I think that is just my personal experience. I did that with my boys. I would have all the stuff in the house, and they did not. I mean,
I love it.
I love a potato chip, but my kids, they don't really care about that because it was always available.
It's always available.
Yeah, and so there was not that oh my God, okay, if I don't eat all of it, it's going to be gone tomorrow, and I'm not going to have another chance.
Absolutely. And if you go into my pantry at home, I have a 7-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. The top row is filled with 5 or 6 different sweets. And, everything in moderation, right? My kids can have dessert a few times a week, but I always ask them, are you sure you want it? Or is it just because it's there? But both of them will stop eating when they're full, or some days not want it just because it's available.
Right.
And also by having it available, you're sending the message like there's no good or bad foods. Yes, obviously you want your kids to eat healthy most of the time, but then there's no shame in eating cake, cookies, ice cream. Like, what's the point of life if you can't enjoy some more indulgent foods, right? That's a miserable way to live.
Right.
So that's one of the most important things to work on with clients who struggle with these types of things. And a lot of times it's hard for them, but then, they realize this is like a real sense of freedom. And I'm telling you, it's one of the most important things you could do. So if you're a family who keeps only healthy food at home, maybe start giving some more treats. It's never too late to change those kind of habits.
Yeah, that's like I said, that's a great thing. Okay, so if you start to recognize and you're openly communicating with your, daughter for this purposes when she comes home, is there a time when, like, for instance, you wouldn't send them back to school? Or is that individual? Like if you're that worried.
So, okay, if you're that worried, I would call your pediatrician, tell them the situation. Most of the time, pediatricians will get a college student in really fast. Because what's most important if you're that concerned is that your child gets blood work done and a full medical evaluation done. Just because with these eating disorders, unfortunately, eating disorders are they have the highest rate of death of any mental illness besides substance abuse. And the reason being is that, say you're bulimic, right? It's causing heart issues. Your sodium and potassium are not regulated. With anorexia, you're malnourished, so other electrolytes are off. A lot of times, people aren't drinking enough, so dehydration issues. So that's like the number one important thing. If I would talk to your daughter and be like, how do you feel about, going back to school? We're going to get you a therapist. We're going to get you a dietitian. And if someone has a more severe eating disorder, that's what they need. Not just me, not just a therapist. They need a dietitian most of the time and a pediatrician. Like most of my eating disorder clients, I'm in regular communication with their dietitians and their pediatricians or family doctors, just because you want to make sure everyone's hearing the same thing, and you want to make sure your client is medically okay. These are scary disorders.
Right.
So it depends on the case, but oftentimes someone's able to go back to school with the understanding, like if you want to stay in school, you need to see a therapist weekly and this dietitian, and you need to sign a release for me so I could be involved too. Because and it's so interesting. I love this. Nowadays, most college students are like, I'm happy to sign a release for my mom. I tell her everything anyway.
Right.
And that's so important because the therapist needs to talk to the parents too, to understand family dynamics and to understand, who your daughter was when she was growing up in high school. All that stuff makes such a difference for therapy and getting someone better. So did I answer your question?
Yes, no, that's awesome. Okay, so you touched on something you were saying something about
drunkorexia.
Drunkorexia. I've never heard that phrase before. So what is that?
Okay, so it's basically, and it's happened, not just in sororities, but, in college culture, but it tends to probably happen more in sororities and it's usually a group of girls who are like, I'm going to eat perfectly all week so I could drink on the weekends and get my calories there. And then what happens is on the weekends, they're drinking and then they allow themselves to have foods they wouldn't normally allow themselves during the week. And it just sets up a really dangerous pattern where, you're restricting and then you're letting yourself engage in impulsive behaviors that aren't good for you. And that could definitely trigger an eating disorder. I think, especially in sororities, not all, but a lot of them, there's a big culture around partying and mixers and, at a Big Ten school or an SEC school, the football games, right? People are drinking in the mornings. It's part of the culture. So this happens a lot. It really does, where people will be like, okay, I'm going to get engaged in all this behavior over the weekend, and then restrict during the week. So that's where it could set someone up for problems.
And so how would you suggest that people listening recognize that? And I mean, both young women and their mom, how do you fix that?
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's by really looking at how you're drinking, right? And like, if it's a problem, right? If that's something, right, you feel like you need to do, maybe like you need to look at your drinking and make some changes in it. Or, maybe you need to like commit to really eating like healthier during the week, not restrictive eating, like healthy eating where you're getting like your healthy fats, proteins, carbs, and hopefully then it'll set you up to not engage in such impulsive behaviors over the weekend. I do think this is something so important to discuss in sororities as a group, that this happens, and like how could our sorority culture make this better, right? Because
that's
this
a great
isn't
idea.
good for us. Yeah. And like, I mean, I love talking to sororities. I love doing presentations with them because so much, like, most of these women want to help out their sisters, right? They want to help promote a great culture in the sorority, right? Like, they really care about it. It's a big part of their lives. And, sorority sisters can do so much good for other sorority sisters, right? Because if they're aware and knowledgeable about what eating disorders are and all these like subtypes and what you can do to help, they could promote body positivity in the house, right? They could be careful about how everyone's talking about food and eating and dieting. They're just more empowered to do things about it and to like look at the culture and be like, okay, like, yes, this is a culture. It's not going to change a ton, but what can we do within the culture to make it healthier?
That's great. Yeah. I'd love to hear that. And I think that is for you guys listening, there's so many takeaways from this, but I think that if you're a mom of a sorority girl, you should maybe consider hiring Dr. Van Beck to talk to your sorority, because I think there's so many things that, well, like I said, we have the resources for, and I think people really want to help. I think that would be a great thing for me to also try to focus on too. Add one more thing to my list, because I want the healthy, happy sorority girls and not sorority girls. I think that all of this, that college is such a time for change and big things, and growing up is part of it, and having the tools to do that in a healthy way that's really amazing. So
Absolutely. And like a new trend that I've seen in sororities up in Michigan is like a lot of them have health and wellness chairs now, which is fantastic because
oh wow, we did not have that in the 80s.
I know. There's so many like great things about sorority culture right now, because I think they are becoming more aware of like mental health and, just having someone to come in the community who's an expert to speak to the girls. The sorority usually really benefits from it. I'll get like notes that was so helpful and like, hey, like this person's struggling. What can I do as a friend? So,
and that's another thing. The friend, I feel like I see this a lot in it's, friends they're not scared. They're not scared to say, okay, my friend is struggling. I'm not just going to sit by and I'm not going to ignore this. Like they seem to be, at least with me, very proactive and supportive, and they're not trying to, they're not worried like, oh, she's gonna be mad at me. They're like, we're gonna fix this, and yeah. I see that a lot, and I love that. I love that.
I love that too.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's like this new generation of women they're so empowered. They're assertive. They know what they want. I'm like, it wasn't always like that. And, they're also, and I think what's so important to note is that, they're dealing with so much negative stuff we didn't need to deal with. Like the social media
Oh
where
my
everyone
God.
is airbrushed, right? Like everyone has an app on their phone to make their skin clearer, themselves a little bit skinnier. Like nothing is real. And like, you know, especially with these algorithms, oftentimes you're seeing people who, you know, they don't actually look like that in real life.
Right.
And like, you know, with like the Rush Talk videos, the outfits of the day, the
Ugh.
girls in the sororities, I think, who tend to fill up sororities' Instagram feeds, right? Like that culture could promote a really
Competitive.
competitive, slim sense of what beauty is,
Right.
right? And like, you know, it's so hard because social media is such a part of, you know, college students' lives nowadays. But being aware that like this isn't entirely real and like, you know, and spending as little time on that kind of social media as possible is so useful. But that's another thing that chapters can do is like to look at their Instagram feeds. Am I featuring girls with different body types, or am I only, you know, featuring those girls, you know, with one body type, you know? And I mean, unfortunately, right, in a lot of sororities, like looks can be a very important thing during rush, and, you know, having a certain body type. And, you know, I think we're going away from that more and more.
But I think you make a great point. It's important for people to recognize that it's not all real. And it's not the okay, so if people want you to speak or if they're looking for a therapist, you said you're licensed in 42 states?
Yeah, so I looked it up. I'll tell you the states I'm not licensed in. The only southern state I'm not licensed in is Louisiana. So I could see clients in every state besides California, Oregon, Montana, Iowa, New Mexico, Alaska.
Wow.
Yeah, which is great for access because there's not that many eating disorders. The other thing with, you know, if your daughter has an eating disorder, really ask a therapist you're considering her working with what their experience is. Unfortunately, with a lot of these big mental health companies that hire people, they'll put down someone's like, you know, an expert in eating disorders, and then you talk to them and they have like very little or no experience. And like, this is a kind of issue where like you really want to work with a specialist, or it could be actually more harmful than helpful. So
That's good to know. Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel like if they reach out to you, that you could guide them if
Sure. And you know what? I'll give you 2 more websites where there's ways to find therapists who specialize in eating disorders that I know like kind of screened the therapist before. One is the National Alliance for Eating Disorders. And for more education for parents, there's some like great sites giving a lot of education about eating disorders. My favorite, there's a center. They have several locations throughout America. They're residential, inpatient, although they have some outpatient programs too. It's called Eating Recovery Center. Highly acclaimed, fantastic eating disorder treatment center. And they have a wonderful for families section on their website with lots of interesting articles if you want to learn more about this.
That's nice. Thank you. That's great to have, you know, because I'm sure I could Google it and I would be so overwhelmed. So thank you.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So now the fun part. Hashtag observation of the day. Bama Rush popularized the hashtag OOTD, which we don't want people looking at. Outfit of the day. But for Mad Rush, I'm repurposing hashtag OOTD into observation of the day. So what is your hashtag observation of the day?
Okay. So
I knew y'all. I knew sometimes there are people like shell shocked when I ask that question, but I'm telling you, this Dr. Jennifer Van Beck is, she's prepared. So I guarantee you she's prepared this.
So I'm going to give everyone an exercise to try that you will find is really helpful for your well-being. Okay, I want you to take a day, and every time you're thinking about food, weight, body image, or if that's not your issue, feeling anxious, depressed, or just like feeling off, anyone could do this. I want you to try to log the minutes you're spending in that frame of mind. And you don't have to be perfect about it, but maybe you realize like 5 minutes in the car, right? And then like 5 minutes in between, work meetings or whatever. Because what a lot of people find, especially women with eating disorders, is that they're thinking about food and body image and negative stuff about them for like 5-6 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
And then your assignment is to plan activities that take up some of that time, because what an amount of time to be spent on that, right? And that's a tool I give a lot of clients, because people then realize like, oh my goodness, I'm spending so much time thinking about this. And then they're able to be like, I don't need to tell them. They're like, that's obviously not healthy. Like,
that's
amazing. I need to start thinking about other stuff.
That's a great observation.
Can I give one more?
Of course,
my
of course.
favorite coping skills. Okay, I'm really big on mindful eating. And it doesn't have to be about having an eating disorder. But when you eat, try your best to eat without TV, newspapers, magazines, or your phone. Put them in the other room if you have to. Obviously, eating with people is okay. But if you're focused on your food, you're going to enjoy it so much more. You're going to be able to tell your hunger and fullness cues more. And you're going to feel like really good, like you're enjoying food. Food is meant to be enjoyed. So many people tell me that this transforms their lives. And try it at your next meal. Try it, and a lot of people will find it really hard. And some of it is like they kind of get bored. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of times they're like, hey, like this amount is good for me. I don't need more.
Right.
But it just like no chips in front of the TV. If you're gonna have chips, put them in a bowl, sit at your table, eat them, and then watch TV.
That's great advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
I find myself doing that. Those are great observations. Okay, well, you guys will be able to find her in the show notes, but tell them how they can find you. And then, like I said, this will all be in the show notes. And I think that she's a great resource for many things.
Thank you, Trisha. So the best source to find out more about me is my website, www.drdrjennifervanbeck.com. And I just started an Instagram, so I'm learning the ropes, but I have a few posts of.
She's very behind the times in Instagram, but also because of what you do, which I would imagine that's going to be a slow grow, for sure.
Yeah.
Just because, if I was following a therapist, so I feel like that's going to be a slow growth. So I think website is awesome.
Definitely. There's a lot of information about me and my experience on there. But my Instagram is Dr. Jennifer Van Beck.
Okay.
And my contact information is on my website. So if you have any additional questions, don't be afraid to call, text, or email.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's very generous of you. And that's one thing I'm blown away by, when I have someone like you that's so generous with your time and expertise. It's such a gift that you're willing to, help people figure this out. And I appreciate it, and I'm very grateful you were here today.
Thank you, Trisha. I'm grateful to be here.
Welcome to Time Out with Trisha. Because can you really give advice if you don't speak about yourself in the third person? I don't think so. This is exactly how I speak to my clients. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. Now let's get into it. Okay, so much of what Dr. Van Beck said bears repeating. And I think the most important thing that I took away from that, and I know timeouts with Trisha are usually about preparing for rush, but I think something that's so important in rush and when your daughter or son is at college is just the communication. I think that was very glaring to me. So if you have a lot of communication with your daughter, you can spot things, or son, I guess. You can spot things quicker and you can jump on things faster and hopefully resolve them in a positive way. So communication is key. Make sure that you're asking a lot of questions and that you're not scared to talk about issues that may be a little more intense. I feel like that is the secret sauce for making sure that your child has a healthy and happy college, and beyond.
And that's it for Time Out with Trisha. We'll see you on another episode of the Mad Rush Podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Mad Rush Podcast. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. For additional Rush tips, updates, and more, please follow me on Instagram at Rush with Confidence. If you would like to reach out to us or for more information, please email info@madrushpod.com. This podcast is produced by Collier Landry and Don't Touch My Radio. Copyright Trisha Adams.